to the Bible by the week. We are in week 14, which is Judges 3 to 21, pretty much the whole book except the first two chapters. And the first two chapters, especially chapter 2, really lay out that Joshua, who had led Israel's armies in conquering the promised land, has died and his whole generation dies. And then in chapter 2, it tells us there's this cycle that begins. Now, if you've heard the story of Samson or Gideon, if you had these, growing up as Sunday school, you might not realize that these stories are just part of a cycle that occurs over and over and over again. And that cycle is the message of Judges. It's all written to kind of set up the idea of Israel having a king, even though initially, you might remember, God was to be their ruler and they were to follow him. As Moses was dying in Deuteronomy, he predicts that they will someday want a king because that's what all the other nations have. And sure enough, that happens. And Judges really sets that up by describing the chaos that increasingly happens in Israel after Joshua and his generation die. So in chapter 3, we have this description of 6 enemy nations that remain in Canaan, in the promised land. And we're told that the Lord doesn't drive them out. In chapter 2, we're told it's because he is furious at Israel for turning to false gods. They keep turning to the false gods of the Canaanites, of these nations, which they had been warned against again and again and again, and they violate the covenant with God. And it was a conditional covenant. Remember, they were only going to be blessed if they obeyed the covenant, but instead they turned to these false gods. And as a result, the cycle is this. The Israelites turn to false gods. They turn away from the true God. And so God withdraws his hand of protection from them. People today think that God strikes you with lightning if you do something bad. Of course, that's not the way it works. If so, we'd all be better behaved and we'd all hate God. No, what he does is he withdraws his hand of protection. The people are conquered or at least harassed by an enemy nation. And then after a time, they cry out to the true God, and he raises up somebody to exercise his judgment on this enemy nation. And that's why they're called judges. They're not judges in the sense of our judicial system. They're judges in that they are the ones who execute the judgment of God on Israel's enemies. So the first of these in chapter 3 is Othniel, who is the nephew of Caleb. Remember, Caleb was, along with Joshua, the young spy into the promised land who is allowed to enter the promised land because he believed and trusted that God could drive out their enemies. So this gets passed along to Othniel, apparently Caleb's nephew, who helps drive out Aram. The king of Aram is oppressing them. When Othniel dies, then Israel turns away from the true God. So Eglon, the king of Moab, all conquers them. And then after a while, Israel cries out and God raises up a judge named Ehud, who happens to be left-handed. Now, this is important because typically when you went into the presence of a king, they would search on your right side for your sword. If you're a righty, you'd pull it from there. But Ehud was left-handed, so his was on his right side. And so they didn't know he was carrying a sword when he went into this king, Eglon. And Eglon was exceedingly fat. The only people who could afford to be fat in ancient times were kings and nobles. He was extremely fat. And so in a TMI detail, Ahab draws his sword and plunges it into the belly of King Eglon. And he's so fat that the folds cover over the hilt of the sword. And Ahab is able to escape because the servants are used to King Eglon taking a long time in the bathroom. Which doing a lot of overeating can do that to you. And so Ahab escapes because they don't want to disturb their king. They say, well, he must be relieving himself. So that wasn't a story that was in the Sunday school curriculum when I was growing up, but it's kind of interesting. There's another judge just briefly mentioned called Shamgar. This time it's the Philistines that have been oppressing Israel, and he kills 600 of them with an ox goad. Presumably, it's a long stick that he uses it as a spear. We don't know the details. Um, then there is a king called Jabin, and he has a famous general named Sisera. And Sisera oppresses Israel, and the people cry out, and God raises up, this time, a prophetess, a female prophet named Deborah. She's famous, right? And she is the leader of the people. She calls out a guy named Barak to lead the armies of Israel. Barak says, I'm not sure that I can do this. I'll only do it if you, Deborah, come with me because I know God's with you. And so, because of that, Deborah, the prophetess, predicts that because he's not willing, he doesn't have the courage to lead the armies of Israel by himself, a woman will have the honor and receive the glory for killing Sisera, the enemy general. And sure enough, Sisera flees the defeat of his army by Israel. He comes to the tent of apparently a family, a tribe that's been somewhat collaborators, somewhat friendly. And a woman named Jael says, "Here, all you can hide in my tent." She brings him into her tent, which wouldn't normally be searched for a male. And she says, "You must be so thirsty." And of course, he is after this battle. So she gets him some nice milk to drink. And you know what warm milk does? Lulls him to sleep. And then she takes a big tent peg, because they live in tents out in the desert, and a hammer, and she drives it into his head and kills him. Another detail that I'm often amazed that Hollywood hasn't made the whole book of Judges into a series because it's so filled with sex and violence, the things of compelling drama in our day and age. Uh, anyway, there's an entire chapter where Deborah and Barak sing a song of praise to God for this victory. But immediately after, when these two leaders pass on, Israel again turns from God. And so the nation of Midian oppresses them. And then Israel repents, and God sends an angel to a man named Gideon. And it's kind of humorous, actually, because Gideon is threshing wheat down in a well, basically a pool where he can't be seen from the outside. And he's doing that because what armies would do, of course, was they would feed themselves on the conquered nation's grain, right? And so he's threshing the wheat down in this pit so that he won't be discovered by the Midianites, so he'll have food to feed his family. In other words, he's hiding when the angel calls him a mighty man of valor and says that he should, it's a wine press actually that he's threshing the wheat in, that he should raise up and call to the people of Israel in order to conquer the Midianites. Now, the angel gives Gideon a sign, and just to show what the situation is, Gideon's family are a bunch of idolaters. They worship false gods. And so Gideon, based on the conjuring of fire, this sign of the angel, he goes and destroys the altars that belong to his family and brings down their idols, their false gods. And his family wants to kill him when they discover it the next day. Fortunately, his daddy, Joash, defends him, and we're told that the Spirit clothes Gideon, right? It's not the guy on the inside who's really timid. It's the Spirit of God that is doing this work through him. And so he calls Israel to war, but he still is so timid, and he famously lays out a fleece for a couple of nights and says, God, if this is really your will, then cause the dew to come everywhere except for on the fleece. And that's what happened. God, if this is really your will, cause the dew to fall on the fleece and not anywhere else. And, God, again, interestingly, allows Gideon to test him, or at least test his will, because he's chosen Gideon to lead the army. So now that Gideon is convinced, he calls on Israel to gather, and 32,000 Israelites come to fight Midian. And God says, Gideon, you got too many people there, because if this big army defeats Midian, then they're going to think that it's their might, the strength of their arms that have done this. So he sends home anybody who's fearful. Remember there was a law against if you're recently married or anything like that. Anybody who's afraid of this, and he still has too many people. And so God tells him to watch when the men go down to drink, and those who lap like a dog, take them, they'll show, that the victory is from them, is from God. And so he does this, and he gives Gideon another sign, and he calls on him to attack Midian in this way with just 300 troops. What they do is they take lamps, oil lamps, and put them in jars, right, where they have enough vent, but they aren't going to be seen or produce light at night. And they take trumpets. Now, we call them trumpets. They probably were ram's horns. That's what people used. And they sneak up on the Midianites, and then they smash their jars, and all of a sudden these fires appear all around in the hills around the Midianite camp, and these trumpets are blown, and trumpets are typically, signals for the army, and the Midianites panic. And they're already nervous about this because God's Spirit has made them afraid. And these 300 Israelites drive out this vastly greater army. And so Gideon becomes a hero, of course, among the Israelites, and they're hankering for a king. He doesn't want to be a king. And so, but he has to deal with some things. First of all, the Ephraimites, claim that they weren't invited to the party, and so he flatters them to get out of that. He captures the Midianite kings. He teaches the men of Succoth and Penuel, who have not joined with Israelite, who are hardcore. He teaches them a lesson, and he executes the enemy kings, which is the right thing to do. You don't want your enemy kings to raise up an army, and of course they have every reason to go after revenge. After that, though, the people of Israel want to make him a king. He doesn't want to become a king. What he wants to become is a priest. And so he makes an ephod, which you might remember is the breastplate that the priests would wear. And the Israelites were told, whore after it, meaning that they lust after this object rather than the God that the object was intended to serve. And so it becomes a snare to them, and they worship Baal after Gideon dies. Once again, they fall into idol worship, even after these amazing sign of God's power in, with just 300 men defeating this vastly greater army. Now, after Gideon, the son of a concubine of Gideon, and a reminder that there was a lot of plural marriages in the Bible. None of them were ordained by God. This was not God's will. This is a description, not a prescription, and it causes trouble time after time after time. We saw that with Jacob and his two wives. We saw it with Abraham and Hagar, and the same with this concubine that is a mistress of Gideon. Through her, he has a son named Abimelech, and Abimelech has aspirations to become king. In Israel, a lot of Israel wants a king, and so he tricks and kills his 70 half-brothers, all these descendants of Gideon, destroys his legacy so that he, Abimelech, can be king. And he conquers, towns until eventually he's confronted, or at least the people in Israel who are supporting Abimelech are confronted, and the people start to turn on him, and Abimelech starts to go after them violently. And as he's attacking a tower, I think in Gibeah, a woman takes an upper millstone, and you remember they used big round stones to crush the wheat, to separate the wheat from the chaff, tosses it off the wall, and it crushes Abimelech's head. And he's got a crack in his skull. He's dying. He tells his sword bearer, go ahead and run a sword through me so that nobody can say I was killed by a woman. That was the disgrace and how the Lord took revenge on him. Well, I don't know if I want to say revenge. In the Lord's case, it's justice. And even at that, you think he'd get off easy for killing 70 of his brothers. Then we have these two minor judges that we don't know much about, Tola and Jair. But again, Israel keeps turning to idols every time there's not a judge to rescue them and to lead them. So the Philistines and the Ammonites oppress them. And then we have Jephthah, who is another son, this time of a prostitute, who's recruited. He must have been a very well-known warrior. He's recruited to lead the fight, and we're told that he is filled with the Spirit. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, the Old Testament and the New Testament, God often chooses people that we wouldn't necessarily choose, people that are scandalating. We see this in the genealogy of Jesus. We see this in his choice of disciples. We see it throughout the Old Testament as well, that God chooses people who don't have stellar reputations, but he's filled with the Spirit. Unfortunately, as he's coming back from a battle, he has made a vow that whatever first comes out to greet him from his household, he will sacrifice that creature. Assuming, that it's going to be, I don't know, a dog or something like that. And it turns out to be his only daughter who runs out to meet him. And he's heartbroken. It's his only child. He loves her. Um, but he feels that to save face among the Israelites, he needs to keep this vow. And so his daughter asks, if she can have a month with her friends to grieve, and he allows that. And then he kills his own daughter because he made this rash vow, and his own honor is more important to him than the life of his daughter. By the way, I'll be talking probably later on in the series about the difference between an honor culture and an integrity culture. This is still a force at work in the world, but an integrity culture values the person above saving face, and an honor culture values your family's honor over people. And honor cultures continue to cause so much trouble in our world, but they are a big part of our world still. So we'll be talking about that, I'm sure. It was most evident, by the way, in the children of Israel, the sons of Israel, who, to defend the honor of their sister, went out and killed all the men of the city where she had been raped. Even though they offered to make it right and to marry her and so on, they went and had those men circumcise themselves, thinking that they would join with the Israelites. And then these two brothers went out and killed them all because the family honor was more important than the wishes of their sister. And their father Israel tells them, "You've made us a stench in our neighbors' nostrils. How can they trust us?" And this is an example of honor culture over an integrity culture. So anyway, this was again illustrated in Jephthah. He dies, but before that happens, the Ephraimites are taking offense again at being left out of the war. Remember, Ephraim is across the Jordan. It takes them a while to get to the battles. And Israel's had it. The Gileadites, people of Gilead in Benjamin, are viciously upset with the Ephraimites. So as they're crossing the Jordan, they lay a trap, and they ask them to say, "Well, if you're on our side, say Shibboleth." And apparently the Ephraimites had a bit of an accent from the people that they lived with, and they would say Sibboleth. And as a result, they would kill them, recognize them by their accent, even though these are fellow tribes of Israel. We have this infighting in Israel. Chapter 13, we once again have the Israelites oppressed. An angel tells the parents of a child named Samson that he should be raised as a Nazirite. And you go back to the law of Moses, you hear that this means that he won't cut his hair, he won't touch alcoholic drinks, and they raise him as an Israelite. Unfortunately, he grows up and he marries a Philistine woman, and she tricks him. The Philistines, of course, are rivals of Israel. She tricks him with a riddle in a riddle contest, and he's supposed to pay 30 sets of clothing. Remember, clothing was extremely valuable. Most people only had one set, maybe two. And he gets the clothing to pay off his debt by killing 30 Philistines. So that starts this kind of revenge contest. And the Philistines repay him by giving this wife, or presumably they were just engaged. I'm not sure how their law allowed it, but she's given to another man because Samson's out doing his thing, and And so he takes his revenge by catching a whole bunch of foxes, tying their tails together, and attaching a torch, a lit torch, and sending them through the fields, the ripe fields of the Philistines, and basically torching all their crops. Well, they then take revenge on Samson by burning his wife. And he then turns around and wants to take revenge on them. He takes the jawbone of a donkey, apparently sharpened like a knife, and he, because of his great strength, kills 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. Um, that's not the end of it. Later, Samson, now single, is seduced by a woman named Delilah. I'm always amazed because I think there's like a radio host called Delilah. It's not a great name to name your daughter because Delilah is the one who seduces Samson, and Samuel is all brawn and no brains, it seems like. And he eventually tells Delilah the secret of his strength, which really is he's a Nazarite, and so the Spirit fills him. But she sneaks up on him while he's asleep and cuts his hair, and he loses his strength because his Nazarite vow has been violated. And this allows her people, the Philistines, to capture Samson and to blind him. They poke out his eyes, they put him in chains, and they put him on display in the temple of their God so that he can be mocked and ridiculed and their great glory and superiority to Israel can be shown. The only thing is, Samson's hair has been growing and his vow is restored. And so, as he's chained to the posts in this temple, and there are thousands, 3,000 Philistines gathered around some of the balconies and so some below, Samson uses the great strength that the Lord gives him to pull down these pillars and collapse the balcony and the ceiling of this temple, killing 3,000. It kills him at the same time, but this is how he eventually wins this revenge contest, which is so typical of tribal justice, right? That things just keep accelerating. You did this, I'm going to do worse to you. Well, I'm going to do worse to you. This was what caused some of what caused so much chaos in the time of the judges, that they couldn't just live according to God's law. So we have Samson, of course, has passed away. And then we have this weird story at the end of Judges. There's this man named Micah who has stolen money from his mother, but then he's afraid, so he gives it back. And the mother celebrates that and says, okay, we should do something with this because it's a gift that you changed your mind and you got this back. And so she uses it to make a shrine to false gods and an ephod, which again is this breastplate. So they're combining a little bit of Israel's worship of the true God with the worship of false gods. And she makes these little false, household gods. And a Levite who is roaming, who shouldn't be roaming because the Levites are supposed to have cities within Israel where they enforce the worship of the true God. Anyway, he's from the priestly class, so he gets hired as the household priest. Typically people want to worship God in their own way, not the ways that God commanded them to do. And so 600 men from Dan happened to be passing through, in other words, an army, and they used their strength to kidnap this Levite and the idols for themselves because they believe that these false idols are good luck charms, and they have a Levite who can appeal to the great God Yahweh, and they steal this man, and they capture Laish, far north in Canaan. Now, this is just an illustration of just how corrupt Israel's worship has been. Another one that follows in chapter 19 is that an unfaithful concubine, again, a mistress, flees from her husband, who's a Levite, and she goes to Bethlehem. The husband goes down to Bethlehem to retrieve her, recaptures her, you might say, and he's on his way back to where they live when he stops for the night in Gibeah. Which is in Benjamin, and Bethlehem, of course, is from the tribe of Benjamin, I think. And they take refuge for the night. Now, in an honor culture, hospitality is a huge deal. And so in Gibeah, a man takes them in for the night, and that means that he has vowed to defend them, kind of like Lot defended the angels in Sodom. He takes them in, and a similar type things happen. The men of Gibeah come out, and they want to rape the Levite because of their homosexual lust for him. And the host offers the woman instead, which the men of Sodom didn't accept. These men of Gibeah accept it, and they rape the woman to death. The Levite comes out the next morning to collect his concubine, and she's dead on the doorstep. And, you just don't know who the more depraved person is here. Because the husband then cuts his concubine into 12 pieces and sends a piece to each of the tribes of Israel to illustrate the moral depravity of the people there when there is no justice. And the 11 other tribes are outraged against Benjamin, and so they go to war against the tribe of Benjamin, and they utterly destroy Gibeah. And the tribes take a vow that they're not going to help to repopulate Benjamin. But then they think better of it, and they think, oh, wait, what are we doing? We're supposed to have 12 tribes here, and we've just decimated one of the smallest tribes, Benjamin. How will they ever recover? How will they ever repopulate? And so the people of Jabesh Gilead weren't there for the oath. So they go and murder those people and take their virgin daughters as wives for Benjamin. That's not enough. So the girls of Shiloh, this town, are kidnapped because they have the big outdoor dance. And the men of Benjamin are allowed to, as the women go out, and they're, to kidnap them as wives. Again, you just can't believe the depravity, given the fact that we just read the law of Moses recently, the depravity of Israel. And we say under the judges, when there was a powerful judge who was a godly person, they were much better off. But again and again, the judges would die. There was no plan for succession. They weren't kings, except for Abimelech, who was a terrible king. And at the end of chapter 21, and actually in chapters 17 and 18 and 19 and 21, we have this summary statement, a conclusion that all this wickedness was because Israel had no king, so everyone did as he saw fit. And that sets us up for the development of kings in Israel. Even though it wasn't part of God's original plan, it shows just the chaos. There was no rule of law, and they really needed someone to enforce the laws. So that's where we quit today at the end of the book of Judges. I hope that you are enjoying your readings, and I will see you next week.